During the 1980s, U2 became one of the most critically and commercially successful acts in rock music. However, by the end of the decade, their puritanical approach to both music and performance was beginning to wear thin. It was clear that unless they could reinvent themselves, U2 would be destined to become a heritage act. Their salvation was to come in the form of Achtung Baby.
Achtung Baby feels like the hinge, the exact, as it were, creative midpoint.
I think it's a record that's grown in its importance because of the place that it occupies in what we now know as U2's history.
It somehow still sounds very vibrant and very contemporary, and I think will continue to stand as one of the landmarks of their career.
The album Achtung Baby was the reinvention that U2 so desperately needed. This film is a review of that record, its history and the band who made it.
We drank the wine, everybody having a good time.
The band that would become U2 formed in Dublin during the mid-1970s. They initially came together after Larry Mullen placed an advertisement on their school notice board. The group's lineup quickly solidified, with Bono on rhythm guitar and vocals, The Edge on lead guitar, Adam Clayton on bass, and Mullen on drums.
In the late 1970s, forming a punk rock group in Dublin, you had to kind of make it up as you went along, and they did, and they came up with a very odd, unorthodox sound. I mean, you could pin it to sort of various American new wave acts, like Television in particular, obviously a big influence, but they were very much their own thing. They didn't really sound like quite anybody else.
They were going back to, as it were, the exciting guitar styles of the late 1960s, which had been sort of reduced by the years era of punk to being somehow regarded as sort of arty and wanky and not the sort of thing that kind of proper punk guitarists should be getting involved with.
U2 were one of the first bands to sort of reclaim traditional rock and roll values, if you like, and to weld them to the mood of the early 80s and that whole post-punk sensibility.
By 1980, they were signed to Island Records. They released a series of 4 studio albums that became increasingly popular. By the end of 1984, U2 were a well-regarded and successful group on both sides of the Atlantic. However, it was to be a single performance in the July of 1985 that would best define the early part of their career.
Live Aid was the defining moment of the first phase of their career, where they'd made a series of albums that had gradually been articulating different themes and becoming bigger and more anthemic musically. And in that arena, they really found their size and their stage.
The charismatic thing was Bono going out in the crowd, and he picked out a girl. It came over well. And of course, in popular entertainment, appearance counts for at least as much as substance, at least in something which is making instant impact like that.
Their performance that day was one of the highlights of the day because of that, and because it broke down the barrier between the stars on stage and the people at the event, made it seem a lot more human, even though it was on this massive scale.
After their success at Live Aid, U2 were poised to become one of the most important and popular acts of the 1980s.
Fans began to embrace their sound. Their sound also tended to become a little bit more anthemic.
It was only kind of the middle part of their career that they started to get more anthemic, and along with albums like War, where they became more aggressive and they're waving their white flags. And like many of those bands then, they kind of developed into this kind of stadium sound. And the Joshua Tree then was the record that kind of solidified that.
In 1985, Rolling Stone magazine voted U2 Band of the 80s. But it wasn't until 1987 and the release of their next studio album that they became the biggest rock band of the decade.
They finally really hit the mother lode with the Joshua Tree, which was an you know, an album so huge in the kind of mid to late 80s that it all but blotted out the sun.
And you give yourself away. And you give yourself away. And you give. And you give. And you give yourself away. With or without you. With or without you.
The Joshua Tree was a fascinating record because I think it really had its genesis in Bono's first meeting with Bob Dylan. U2 and Dylan shared the same bill at Slane Castle in Dublin. Bono got talking to Dylan, and it was Dylan who said to him, "You need to know where you've come from to know where you're going," and encouraged him to really look back at the heritage of rock and roll and where it had all come from. And that was a journey that naturally took them to Memphis, where it all started. And Joshua Tree really was their tribute to the wellspring of great American music.
The Joshua Tree is full of references to America and the landscape, and even the photo session, the Anton Corbijn taking them out into the desert. And they almost presented themselves as kind of this Shaker, Quaker, everything in black and white, everything kind of like a kind of a little spiritual colony out in the wilderness kind of thing.
The Joshua Tree was released on the 9th of March 1987. It instantly rose to the top of the charts and garnered the group many awards, including Album of the Year at the 1988 Grammys.
And it had a massive effect. World #1. 2 #1 singles in the States, cover of Time magazine. But more than this, it established them as the U2, which is iconic. They then found themselves suddenly, they were the top of the tree. They were the establishment. Uh-oh. It's all downhill from here unless we can think of a twist.
The twist they thought of was Rattle and Hum, an album which continued to explore the North American roots of popular music.
Rattle and Hum started life as a kind of a fairly low-budget tour film, and it was just essentially a record of the time. This is what it's like, kind of playing all around the world, and people really like us. They also kind of got into this exploration even more of kind of roots music.
It was a continuation, in some respects, of the Joshua Tree themes of the band searching for an identity, looking to American music, which had been European music's inspiration for the whole of the post-war era. They looked to that music to try and drive to the heart of it, literally drive to the heart of it, go around America and find the essence of American rock music and try and divine what that was, and sketch themselves into that tapestry.
The film, which had been conceived by the band as a low-budget tour movie, suddenly expanded into a major motion picture. This, coupled with the rather excessive elements on the companion album, began to attract a critical backlash from the press.
The thing about U2 is they've never done anything by halves. So if they were going to make this album about trying to explore the roots and the spirit of American music, then obviously it was going to be a million miles over the top, and it was. They recorded with B.B. King, they wrote with Bob Dylan, they wheeled in gospel choirs, they dressed up like cowboys, they wrote songs about Billie Holiday. I mean, it was all incredibly well-intentioned, as everything U2 do is, but it just came across as epically pompous.
The marketing of Rattle and Hum was everywhere. You know, they were on the cover of every magazine. They were doing all these simultaneous launches around the world. They were turning up at premieres and busking outside. And I think the world got heartily sick of U2.
Despite the record's problematic reception, it still became an extremely commercially successful album and garnered the group their first UK #1 with the single Desire. Despite these triumphs and being among the most important bands of the 1980s, U2 seemed to be in flux. They had exhausted their American musical journey and were beginning to receive negative criticism. It all came to a head at the end of the decade in Dublin.
They finished the 1980s with a series of dates at the Point Depot in Dublin, and there was a very famous night. It was New Year's Eve, 1989, and Bono did a big speech from the stage, and it was all something like, "We can't go on like this forever," and people almost thought he was kind of abdicating, he was going to break up the band.
Famously, at the end of the 80s, on the last night of the Rattle and Hum tour, Bono said to a crowd in Dublin, "You won't hear from us for a while. We have to go away and dream the whole thing up again." And that's where we come in.
U2 disappeared from public life and began the painful process of reinvention. It was clear that they needed a new direction, and a lack of cohesion threatened to tear the band apart. Eventually, they turned away from their much-laboured American influences and began to look east, towards Europe.
Having spent the past few years trying to locate themselves and replace their myth in the heart of American music, it was very natural and probably very correct for U2 to turn around and begin to look at Europe again.
It seems very counterintuitive that at a moment where everything seems to be in flux or chaos, is that a rock band seeking, one might suppose, a little oasis of creative calm would head straight for the centre of, if you like, of the turbulence of the times.
At the beginning of the 1990s, the Berlin Wall, which had stood as a physical manifestation of the ideological divide between the West and the communist East, was finally being torn down, symbolising a new era, not just for Germany, but also for the rest of the world. It was here, amidst the rubble of communism and the confusion of a newly unified country, that U2 decided to record their new album.
Berlin, at the moment they were recording the album, was probably the most exciting place on earth.
This was the place where the world was changing before our very eyes on our television screens, where the Cold War was collapsing, East was meeting West, new possibilities were emerging.
The dividing line collapsed, and you got these two cultures just merging and running together, and in a very uncertain situation, not knowing quite where the society as a whole was going to be moving. And I think to be in that atmosphere and to be writing an album under those conditions, it must have been a very powerful influence.
The political situation was not the only reason that U2 decided to record in Berlin. Another, more musical factor was David Bowie's work in Hansa Studios during the 1970s.
The psychology of it's fairly easy to figure out. Their last couple of records had been these sort of homages to Americana, so this one they thought they would go to Berlin and they would go to Hansa Studios, where David Bowie made with Brian Eno that sort of series of Cocaine and Paranoia records in Berlin in the 70s, which are about the most European sounding pop music you can think of.
There's a brace of albums which are called the Berlin Trilogy, Low, Heroes and Lodger. And Brian Eno was a collaborator on that series of records as well. And that was David Bowie kind of listening to people like Faust and Kraftwerk and Cluster and Can and Now, and bringing a kind of a pop perspective to very challenging Germanic kind of electronic music.
You play Achtung Baby side by side with David Bowie's Heroes album in particular, which was recorded in Berlin in early 1977, and there is a real extraordinary congruence. One is almost like the kind of the baby brother of the other.
If you two were the artists of the 80s, David Bowie was the artist of the 70s, and he saw it as his responsibility to change with every album. Every album had to have a different sound, a different idea. You know, at the start of the 70s he was glam rock, in the mid-70s he was plastic soul, and then he went into this kind of very dark, kind of dense electronic era. And I think anyone who grew up listening to David Bowie would kind of almost see that as their responsibility as a band to keep changing the rules, to keep changing the tone, the sound, the idea.
Brian Eno's impact on the album was not only as an influence, but also as a collaborator, having worked previously with Daniel Lanois on The Unforgettable Fire and The Joshua Tree. However, all did not go according to plan during the recording process.
The sessions were famously quite rancorous. There was a sort of division in the camp between, I think broadly speaking, between Bono and Edge, who were interested in sort of experimenting and trying to bring in electronic sounds and not sounding like they used to anymore, versus the rhythm section, who generally in the way of rhythm sections were sort of very keen to sort of maintain, true to U2's background and the roots that U2 had already established. They were recording at that stage with the producers Daniel Lanois and Flood and really not getting terribly anywhere. And it was at that point that Brian Eno was sent for, both as, and I think obviously because they knew him because they'd worked with him before very successfully, and also because this was where he'd made those records with Bowie, which was the reason they'd gone to Berlin, well, one of the reasons they'd gone to Berlin in the first place. So that was where Eno's involvement came about.
Brian Eno is always associated with amazing soundscapes. But what he's really good at is group dynamics. He is almost like, he is like the guy who can parachute into a difficult situation of competing egos and interests and find a fun, lateral way of settling disputes or getting people to forget what the problem is and think about something else. He's also he's a curiously egoless person, Brian Eno, and he is unspeakably clever.
The band were looking for a new direction, both thematically and musically. Having explored the history of popular music, they began to look to the future and the dance-rock fusion emanating from Manchester.
The Manchester scene was breaking down a long overdue prejudice between rock music and dance music.
The effect of people like Happy Mondays and the Stone Roses on British youth culture is just massive. Various people in the U2 camp were listening to that saying, look, we can't bash out these old rock anthems. It's not the time for it. I think Adam and Larry were kind of prepared to take up the challenge to have a groove much more than before. And I think if you listen to that record, you can hear quite a lot of kind of references to people like Happy Mondays and the Stone Roses.
Contemporary pop music at that time was a huge influence on the record, but in all sorts of different ways. Part of it was, again, a reaction against rattle and hum and, not wanting to sound like a kind of dust-covered rock and roll band anymore. But I think they were genuinely energized by some of the things that were happening specifically in British music. And when you think of what the big influences on that record were, then yeah, it was a lot of the kind of dance-influenced pop that was coming out of Manchester at the time. And I think you can hear echoes certainly of bands like Jesus Jones. At that time had found a way to take kind of samples and weird electronic sounds and assemble them into what were recognisably pop songs, and very successful pop songs as well.
The likes of Jesus Jones and EMF, and perhaps even Carter the Unstoppable Sex Machine, people who were putting all these different things together around that time and having hits with it and being successful and making an impact on the musical mainstream, on the pop music market. I think just anybody who's adventurous and is obsessed or interested to a significant degree with the history of popular music will probably tend to make records that reflect that interest.
Prior to the album's release, there was a sudden controversy over a set of mysterious work tapes from the Achtung Baby sessions. In April 1991, these tapes had fallen into the hands of bootleggers well before the album's November release date.
May 1991, there was an advert taken out in Music Week, and I think various other places, said that if any dealers or anyone was brought into contact with illegal pressings of U2 sessions, they would suffer the full arm of the law and the music industry and everything. So of course, you know, at NME and everywhere else, we started going around dealers to try and find these mythical records. And they were called the Silver and the Gold record. It was 2 double albums. And essentially, I think it was sessions that were done in the early part of 1990, probably at STS Studios in Dublin. And it was basically U2 trying to find a tone or an idea that was going to kind of establish Achtung Baby. Sound quality was terrible, but you could hear Bono shouting out chord changes to people. You could hear him. He had this. Bono has this style of writing in the studio where he kind of makes up nonsense words and then over a period of time refines them into lyrics. And he calls this kind of Bongolese. It's his kind of his method. And you can hear him on that record just using sounds and words to try and form songs. And I'm not surprised that they didn't want them to come out, because it's like someone seeing your homework.
Despite the tape's release, it didn't take the wind out of the record sales, as the album was finally released to much interest and acclaim on the 19th of November 1991. U2's new album was characterised by a rather enigmatic title that had become somewhat of a catchphrase during the record's production in Berlin.
The title of the album, Achtung Baby, also manifests the same sort of embrace of irony that you find on the album as a whole. It's apparently inspired by a line from Mel Brooks, the producers, "The Fuhrer doesn't say baby."
I got it! What have you got? A medal that fell down my pants, man. Get it out, baby. Dankeschön, baby. Baby! Baby! What does he say, this baby? The Fuhrer has never said baby. I did not write baby. What is it with this baby?
Will you please shut up?
You shut up. You are the audience. I am the author. I outrank you.
What Mel Brooks did was to realize that the way you respond to fascism isn't to argue with it. It's any attempt to really engage with it only ends up glorifying it and validating it. The way you combat fascism is to make fun of it, and that's why the Fuhrer doesn't say, right? You can't talk about the Fuhrer in those sorts of terms. Once you expose it to laughter and to mockery and criticism, then you've deprived it of the mystique which gave it its power. And I think they've on Achtung Baby, that sort of encapsulates what the band has realized, that the most powerful ways to communicate are often through irony, through misdirection, through humor. Those are much more powerful ways of getting their message across than a direct discourse where I just tell you what you think and try and engage you and persuade you through a kind of argument.
It's got the heaviness of Achtung, which anybody will remember from any war film, is what the Hun, the Germans always say, just as they're trying to stop the Stalag breakout or to repel the D-Day invasion or whatever it happens to be. It always has a sinister connotation, whereas Baby, of course, is facetious, Western, light, bit sexy. So it's the play of these two sets of associations.
Like the music contained on the record, the album's distinctive artwork was also drastically different from their 1980s design.
The artwork, again, is a reflection of the two things that were really driving U2 at this point. There was one, the fascination with the new Europe and what it would mean, and how Europe had arrived in the first place at having a situation where a fence was built across the continent, which, though this was only now 17 years ago, still seems like an absolutely bizarre thought, but that was the case. And so there's the reflection of that with the sort of the deployment of the funny coloured, Trabant cars, those hopeless little paper mache East German sedans. But a lot of the rest of the imagery, again, the other thing driving the record is just that revolt against everything they'd become. And there was nothing more un-Rattle and Hum and un-Joshua Tree than sort of dressing up in kind of, rhinestones and feather boas.
The Joshua Tree and Rattle and Hum were essentially black and white covers for the artwork. And black and white is considered to be real, it's sincere, it's what those records were about. It's kind of tradition. Whereas if you look at the cover of Achtung Baby, it's kind of like a kaleidoscope.
What Achtung Baby evokes is Exile on Main Street by the Rolling Stones, which is a montage, sepia pictures, but all the same a montage of snapshots by the American photographer Robert Frank of the Rolling Stones. It was meant to give the impression of an album which is a bit documentary, done on the fly, that there's something not quite casual or sort of knocked off about it, but it was meant to be taken at a slightly in a less serious, sat-down frame of mind than you would an album where you have the four solid portraits of the act looking at you.
Achtung Baby was clearly a decisive break from the band's anthemic past. But how exactly did the record differ from their previous work?
The big difference between Achtung Baby and all their previous records was this immediate impression of tension and dissidence and a kind of inward aggression.
Bono has discovered irony, and he's become a master of masks and a master of exploring different kinds of personas, different kinds of ways of being in the world. In Joshua Tree, I think it's just very straightforward, very preachy. You know who the speaker is, and you either like him or you don't. And people who like the speaker of the Joshua Tree relate to it very strongly. On Achtung Baby, it's a great work of art. He's presenting lots of different personas, lots of different ways of approaching life and ways of approaching the world, and doing it with irony and with humor. And I think that really takes it from being, takes their music from being music that delivers a message to music that teaches us something about life.
Nothing demonstrates U2's decision to move away from their musical past more clearly than their choice for the first single from the album.
Whether you like them or not, the one thing you could say about The Fly was that it was not what anybody was expecting a U2 record to sound like. Bono did, memorably describe The Fly in particular as the sound of four men trying to chop down the Joshua Tree.
It's no secret that the stars are falling from the sky. It's no secret that our world is in darkness tonight. They say the sun is sometimes eclipsed by a moon. I don't see you when she walks in the room.
In U2 terms, that was a very radical release. Especially, we hadn't heard from U2 for several years at that stage. And they come back with a kind of very metallic kind of guitar sound. It was all chopped up. It sounded like Nine Inch Nails or something like that. And Bono's voice kind of mechanically processed. And then the lyrics, which again, he was kind of playing the devil's advocate very literally. A conscience can sometimes be a pest. All those kind of lines, which totally inverted everything that you thought about Bono, that he would kind of teach you that black was black and white was white, and all of a sudden it was this completely ambiguous kind of thing.
One of the criticisms that had been levelled at Rattle and Hum was its pomposity, and that the band at that time had definitely got this reputation for being issues-based and maybe a little bit hectoring, and certainly, while their sincerity wasn't doubted, that maybe their sincerity had become heavy-handed. Allowing himself to construct this alter ego that enabled him to be ironic and glib, sometimes to spout words that he himself almost certainly didn't hold personally.
The character of The Fly is an example of, I think, Bono working through these different personas, getting inside a certain way of being in the world and exploring it and seeing how far it can take us and whether ultimately that's a satisfying way to exist, satisfying way to live. I think the answer in The Fly's case is no. The Fly is, he's someone you'd want to invite to a party. He's witty, he's ironic, he holds himself at a distance from things. He's aware of the deep despair that can be found in human existence, but he doesn't offer a solution.
Because it's U2, though, it's not allowed to become entirely hopeless. There's the choruses are a competition between his sort of like, you know, his kind of like cackling Grim Reaper sort of telling us the world's going to hell in a bucket, but he's trying to be heard over a gospel choir, saying, you know, offering the suggestion that it may all work out anyway. There's that tension from a band who previously appeared to have no doubt about these things at all is kind of interesting, and really did signpost that they were up to something profoundly different this time.
U2's radical departure from their old sound and their flirtations with the more macabre themes of The Fly alienated and upset some of their loyal fan base.
Some of the old fans were a bit distraught. They saw him as this kind of exemplary person, a spiritual leader, suddenly kind of saying a conscience can sometimes be a pest. And one fan met him after a concert and said, look, what's going on here? And he said to her, I'd like you to go and read the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is a man who created Narnia, among other things, but he was a big Christian writer. And the Screwtape Letters is a fictional series of letters from a senior devil to an apprentice devil about how to kind of tempt the humans kind of on this world. And in a sense, that is what The Fly is doing. You know, it's temptation. And then C.S. Lewis said, you know, if you want to understand the devil, you must study his works. So, well, some people thought Bono was kind of leaving his faith behind. He was just finding a new way to test it and challenge it.
The Fly character gave Bono and the band different ways, or different outlets to express different things in different ways. There's also the fact that, you know, there's that line in The Fly, isn't there, where he says, it's true that your conscience can sometimes be a pest. Now, clearly, somebody whose conscience had led him to do some, and would later lead him to do some really world-changing things, can't seriously believe that that having that conscience has been somehow a problem.
The album opens with Zoo Station, a song that serves a similar purpose to that of releasing The Fly as the first single.
So much of what you think of a record depends on the sequencing, and if they had started with a traditional song like One, you probably would have been thinking, here we go, another traditional record from U2. Instead, they pitch you into this incredible confusion.
The song's actually quite an optimistic one. It's, you know, I'm ready for the laughing gas, I'm ready to take my hands off the steering wheel. It's a kind of abandonment of everything that's gone before them. There's more going on than that. There always is, which is why this is such a clever record. And it could just as easily be perceived as a song about the new Germany and about the new Europe.
Zoo Station being this tube station in Berlin where people from the East were coming up, literally looking around. It was almost like arriving in Disneyland. Here's this mad place with all these colours, these lights, these things you could buy, these flash cars, and they're confused, they're exhilarated. And that's kind of U2, kind of, it's a great sensibility. You're thrown into this confusing world that they have built up around the record as well. So you are supposed to be confused, disconcerted, stimulated, excited, confounded. It's one of the great openings.
That reference to Zoo Station in Berlin is very clever. There's an U-Bahn line, a subway line, that runs through Zoo Station. It's U-Bahn number 2. So U2 is the line that runs through Zoo Station. They talk about being 2 stops down from Zoo Station. If you look 2 stops down from Zoo Station, it's either Deutsche Oper, the German opera house, and we know that opera was very important to Bono through his relationship to his father, and so on. And the other direction, 2 stops down from Zoo Station, is Nollendorfplatz, which is a notorious center of nightlife and counterculture, alternative culture, lots of gay bars and so on. And Zoo Station is this very wild, decadent spot right in the middle of that. So symbolically, there's lots of interesting things going on with putting a song in motion along U2, line U2, heading towards Zoo Station.
The lyrics in that song may or may not be about U2 and their place in their own musical career, but they're very definitely about being a European at the beginning of the 1990s and wanting to embrace the change no matter where it's going to take you, and to throw yourself into tomorrow not knowing what it's going to bring.
The next song on the record, Even Better Than the Real Thing, demonstrates a new postmodern direction in Bono's lyrics.
It's this idea of kind of a hyper-reality. Almost everything's kind of more real than reality. The advertising world has changed us all, and the media broadcasting world is no longer to be trusted.
Western culture as a whole, in some sense, is moving towards this preference for the artificial, for the hyper-real. And what makes it such an interesting song is it's not dismissing that. You can imagine a Joshua Tree song criticizing us for our preference for artificiality, for hyperreality. This song doesn't. This song acknowledges the power that has on us, and it embraces us. It embraces that a taste for the artificial, for the easy, for the flexible. But at the same time, it's got a warning about it, and gets us to stop and think about it.
You're the real thing. Yeah, the real thing. You're the real thing. Even better than the real thing.
The song is an embrace of the hyperreal. It's an embrace of the nighttime world, and the whole album is a sort of embrace of the nighttime world, the world that shows up when you're out of the harsh reality that sunlight casts on things. And this song is right at sunset, the crimson sky, the sun is setting. It's now safe for Icarus, who constructed wings for himself in Greek mythology, to take flight because the sun won't melt his wings. He's free to launch off in these travels of fantasy and enjoying artificiality.
A missile of some kind.
Anyway, here's the first release of the album.
And a devastating hit. Went straight down the road. Las Vegas crashed.
You're free to fly, the crimson sky. The sun won't melt our wings tonight.
Even Better Than the Real Thing was also released as a single, not, however, in the same form as it appears on the album.
The song on the album is a kind of it's okay. It's a kind of a good little kind of tune. They gave it to Paul Oakenfold, who was kind of one of the kind of big Ibiza kind of DJs at the time, bringing that whole Balearic kind of sensibility into the British music. And he turned it into a big four-to-the-floor stomper, really. You know, a lot of the subtle corners were bashed out, but it gave U2 probably their first big dance floor kind of moment.
It's a way for them to do something which is not in their previous tradition. It's not a heritage release. Again, they're trying to push the territory, at least their own perimeters.
The thing with Even Better Than the Real Thing is that for all the talk and the hype over the remix and Oakenfold's involvement and this new dance music direction, it is at its heart a very strong traditional rock song. It stands up in either version.
During the Berlin recording sessions, U2 experienced difficulty in finding the direction for their new record, until finally they hit on the song One.
Well, One, for a start, is the song, as all accounts of the sessions agree, is actually the song that made the record and arguably kept U2 together. The song, by all accounts, just descended on them while they were jamming, you know, at the end of a fairly fractious day in Hansa Studios in Berlin.
It gelled the band at a time when there was clearly this split between the front guys and the engine room, Larry and Adam. This was the one song where they could all agree, and maybe they felt, actually, we've got our chemistry back. Maybe it's all going to be okay after all.
It pulled them out of a terrible period of despondency. And it was actually kind of a middle eight, which they were planning to use elsewhere, and everybody went, well, that's quite a good song, really. And, you know, in the middle of this supposedly postmodern record, it's just it's a standard ballad, really.
I think people have described One as being the record's insurance policy, haven't they? And I can see why that argument has been put forward. If you take the view that the whole record is a series of risks, that there needed to be something there that would, bail out the project in the event that the rest of the world thought that the risks weren't worth taking. But at the same time, what happens if a song like One comes along?
If U2 are going to be remembered decades, centuries hence for one song, that's it. It really is one of those ones that will be sung for as long as people sing songs.
One is a great song in any genre or style. I mean, I just think it's one of those songs that you could do it as a country ballad, you could do it as a dance track. I mean, it's just a great song and it's indestructible, and it stands on its own in that sense. I mean, it is the highlight of the album, simply because it's probably the highlight of their career.
That is the career song from this record, and they needed one. This was a record that needed it, not because it wasn't good, but because it was different. And it needed a song that people could say, oh, it's U2.
You gave me nothing, now it's all I got. One, but we're not the same. Well, we hurt each other, then we're doing again.
However, despite its classic status, the song has inspired much debate about its precise meaning since its first release as a single in March 1992.
I mean, it's an extraordinary versatile song. It can be read as any one of a number of things. There's an awful lot you can read into it.
I've seen that song expressed about the reunification of Germany. I've seen it used to express Bono's grief over his father's death. They've sung it about Northern Ireland. They've sung it about AIDS. They've sung it about Africa. It's a very plastic song. You can put it almost into any sentimental kind of scenario, and Bono can make that song resonate with that moment.
It's not about just one thing, and all art is that way. All art speaks to, it presents us with a certain mood, a certain disposition, a certain way of understanding relationships between people and people with their world that can be carried from one context to the other.
Interestingly though, one of the things that you cannot read into that song in any way, shape or form is any kind of faith in that things are ultimately going to be okay. It just isn't there. And the band themselves, I know, have spoken many times of their utter incomprehension at the fact that people want to get married to this song. I'm not quite sure what's going on in the head of someone who wants to walk up the aisle to the lyric, "You gave me nothing, now it's all I've got."
It's funny how it's been misunderstood as an affirmative song about love relationships, and I think that's because of the music. You have Adam's very comforting bass line leading you through the song. It's circular, it's repetitive, it constantly leads you higher, gives you a sense of satisfaction and comfort, and then the way the song ends with Edge's exuberant guitars, it's pointing you musically toward a kind of experience of love which would be truly redemptive, and that counteracts the very dark message of the lyrics themselves.
Until the End of the World was originally written for the Wim Wenders film of the same name. It does, however, fit in with the record in that, again, it's a bit of one of Bono's grand conceits. It is fairly transparently, and I don't think there's been much dispute about it since. It's an imagined account of not so much a conversation between Jesus Christ and Judas Iscariot. It's sort of Judas's attempt to explain or justify himself.
In the garden, I was playing the time. I kissed your lips and broke your heart. You were acting like it's the end of the world.
Judas had his part to play in history, and his part in history was to go into the Garden of Gethsemane and kiss his master and alert the soldiers to the fact that this is the man that they had to take away and ultimately kill. And as a character, he gets a kind of a walk-on part in Pride in the Name of Love, One Man Betrayed with a Kiss. And then he reappears then on this record. And it's just a fascinating take, really.
It's no justification of Judas. You know, he finishes the song in absolute despair, reaching out for the one he tried to destroy. So again, it's not sympathy for the devil. It's very much an affirmation of the Christian life.
The story of Judas Iscariot and Jesus is obviously a story of betrayal, and that's to a large extent what this record is about. It's about the way that people betray each other. It's about the way people cheat on each other and on themselves. And I think in sort of, you know, taking sort of human history's most famous example, he's making a fairly explicit statement that that's what the record's about. I think it's significant in terms of sort of the band's own journey within their faith, and Bono's in particular, that he chooses to articulate it from the point of view of Judas and not Jesus. Again, in keeping with the album's theme of faith being doubted and faith being tested, I think that's quite important.
The next song on the album is widely considered to be one of Achtung Baby's lesser moments.
There's just something about it that doesn't quite convince somehow.
It sounds very much like almost an outtake from Rattle and Hum as a song.
You don't get the same sort of coherent message. It's not as well crafted lyrically as a lot of the songs on the album are.
I'm always a bit bemused by a surprisingly common view that Who's Gonna Ride Your Wild Horses is a bit of a duffaroo, and one they'd be best off leaving off the record, because it's one of my favourite 3 or 4 U2 songs ever. It may just be me. It's a really powerful, really intimate song, and I think it works really well. Again, I think he's trying to yank together that linkage between betrayal between men and women and the betrayal or disappointment and doubt in faith, because it's fairly transparently a song about, you know, some sort of dysfunctional relationship between two people, but it is couched in quite a lot of unnecessarily biblical language. I think he's trying to pull a lot of that together, and I think actually really successfully.
On Achtung Baby's release, many people noticed a subtle change in Bono's vocal performance. His once staunch rock vocals now had an undertone of the crooners of the 50s and 60s, in particular the work of the Walker Brothers.
Their style of singing was, as it were, dark and Germanic cabaret, as distinct from the rhythm and blues influence, which was mostly what British rock music was in the 1960s. Sense of grandeur, slight sense of doomed romanticism, and doomed romanticism, of course, is one of the keynotes of Achtung Baby.
Is a cloak you wear, a deep shade of blue is always there. The sun ain't gonna shine anymore, the moon ain't gonna rise in the sky, the tears are always clouding your eyes when you're without.
There was definitely a kind of a fascination with the kind of the Vegas kind of crooner at that stage. Almost that idea that there, even though it was cheesy and kind of middle-aged and kind of glitzy, that there could be universal truth in it.
The Frank Sinatras, the Tony Bennetts, the Scott Walkers. And I think the nature of a lot of the songs really did enable him to bring that out. He sort of, to put it tactfully, had not been known up until this point for his subtlety as a vocalist. I mean, he was a great rock singer and a great front man, and and when he really gave it some welly on the big sort of U2 epics like Where the Streets Have No Name or Pride, it sounded great. But again, it was not subtle stuff. And I think he was interested, and I know he's interested in a way, especially that male vocalist voices change as they get older. They acquire an edge, they get deeper, they get a bit more careworn. And though he was by no means an old man when he sang the songs on Achtung Baby, I think he was interested in exploring that. And yeah, that does come across very strongly.
A song on the album that clearly demonstrates Bono's new vocal influences is So Cruel.
You disappeared from me. I gave you everything you ever wanted. It wasn't what you wanted. The men who love you, you hate the most. They pass right through you like a ghost. They look for you, but your spirit is in the air. Baby, you're
So Cruel is one of the more downbeat moments on the record, and there is something about Bono's voice that is different on song, and perhaps it is that he's drawing on that crooning tradition.
So Cruel is just it's a very lovely torch song, and it could be sung by Frank Sinatra. It certainly could have been sung by the likes of Scott Walker or Roy Orbison. Bono had already written a song for Roy Orbison just prior to that. So again, it's in that old tradition, and it's almost like the bloke, you know, breaking his heart in a tuxedo.
You're so cruel.
I think it's a brilliant description of a love relationship gone bad and of the ambiguity that's involved in love. Romantic love for U2 is one of the most important phenomenon to understand in human existence. The problem with romantic love is it's always right there on the knife's edge. It could go bad in all sorts of ways, and so when you're in love, you can have this experience of finding happiness, finding blissful joy, but also always worrying if maybe it's going to end up degrading you or making you more miserable than you were before. And I think that's what So Cruel is, the lyrical line that catches this human condition so perfectly is head of heaven, fingers in the mire. That's our condition, this longing for the eternal, this bodily attachment to the earth. And So Cruel is someone singing to a lover that they had hoped would resolve this contradiction, and they're not doing it. They offer all the promise of heavenly peace and bliss as God's only dove, but in the end it's a very cruel and sadistic relationship that just drives the singer deeper into despair than they were before.
The second single to be released from Achtung Baby was Mysterious Ways.
So Mysterious Ways, which preceded One as a single, and thus in the States had a lot of ground to recover because The Fly had peaked at 61. So for Mysterious Ways to be a top 10 record shows how good it was. Because second single from an album, if the first one hasn't made it, it's a tough ride.
Mysterious Ways is probably the most explicit linkage anywhere on the record between, I guess, spiritual and romantic torment. It's a song about somebody grasping desperately for communion, whether it be spiritual or indeed sexual. There's a number of ways you can read the lines. If you want to kiss the sky, better learn how to kneel. When they played it live on the Zoo TV tour, it was famously illustrated by a belly dancer, you know, waving veils around.
The song's lyrics and the employment of the belly dancer during live performances clearly references the biblical tale of John the Baptist's demise. According to elaborated versions of the story, Salome performs the dance of the 7 veils in order to sexually ensnare King Herod to her will.
The obvious reference is to the most famous of all stories of the lengths a man will be driven to by lust, which was Herod promising Salome anything she wanted if she would dance for him. So she dances for him and then says, "I'd like the head of John the Baptist on a plate, please," which Herod serves up with fairly messy consequences. So I think that's the obvious allusion of that song. And again, the biblical references on this record are never terribly far from the surface.
Mysterious Ways, probably the closest that U2 comes to giving us an answer to love on the album, in my view. You have to let the love of a woman help you relate to the world. And in doing that, you find God. The title Mysterious Ways is an allusion to a hymn by William Cowper, God Moves in Mysterious Ways. They've substituted a woman. A woman in this world is our means of access to God. And it's through a loving, romantic relationship that works that we can find divinity and happiness in the world.
Well, I love She Moves in Mysterious Ways because it's the closest they get on the album to a kind of traditional pop song. And I think there's also a nice, there's a nice symmetry about the history of that song, because if the darkness of the record comes out of Edge's disintegrating marriage, when they performed that song live, they did it with a belly dancer, and the Edge ends up marrying her. And so I kind of like that as an image of how, via that song on the record, they move out of the darkness and into the light.
3 of the final songs on Achtung Baby, Trying to Throw Your Arms Around the World, Ultraviolet, Light My Way and Acrobat, all in some varied way deal with romantic love, both its redemptive qualities and the deep sadness it can cause.
The old U2, if they were going to make a record about, crisis of faith, crisis of love, about desperation and dementia, I think would have been, even if they were going to do that, which they wouldn't have, would have been very, very tempted to kind of round it off with 2 or 3 sort of songs, but saying, if we all hold hands, everything will be okay. Achtung Baby doesn't do that at all.
The last song on the record, Love Is Blindness, also fails to lift the mood.
It's a very cheerless way to end a record, and I think that's good. That's, again, part of the audacity of Achtung Baby, is that there aren't that many kind of easy get-out clauses. So you're ended with a record where they're distraught.
Love is blindness, I don't want to see. Won't you wrap the night around me?
Love Is Blindness is an extraordinarily uncharacteristic finish to a record for U2, because the title itself is such a summation of everything they've been exploring in Achtung Baby. It is literally exploring the idea of love as a disability, rather than something that empowers and inflames people. The whole thing is this possibility that love and faith are things that can cripple people, things that can destroy people.
I mean, there's a line in that song that says, "Love is drowning in a deep well," which by U2 standards is pretty dark. And is it love as an emotion that is always drowning in a deep well, or is it the specifics of a lost love or an unrequited love or a broken love affair, or is it both? But it's coming from a very, very dark place. There is the echo, perhaps, of the Edge's marriage, which is breaking up, the mother of his 3 children. So, reality is intruding in their lives, and I think you hear that.
And Edge's guitar, it just is one of the best things he's ever done, because people have said he was going through this divorce at the time, and I don't think you're oversimplifying the matters to say that he literally was playing his heart out on that track. He's just letting it all hang out, and this song just fizzles out at the end.
it's a song that kind of sums up everything they've been trying to say, which is that there is this idea that love and faith are these two extraordinarily volatile commodities, and whereas previously their catalogue has been about the great things they can drive people to, I think this is the record about what happens when it goes off in your face.
It, I think, sums up that, as it were, the conflict or the sense of the moral landscape being in perpetual poise between romance and frustration, between, as it were, one's good self and one's bad self, about how happy endings aren't automatic.
Love is Blindness is the final example of the record's obsession with the potentially destructive nature of romantic love.
Is exploring different ways that love can go wrong, different ways that love promises us a kind of earthly redemption and earthly bliss, but also it brings us to the brink of despair. And it's just fascinating to see Bono working through these and in very sophisticated and very different ways.
When you're looking for themes on the record, it's possible to listen to almost every song on the record in one of two ways. They could be songs about women or a woman, or they could be songs about God and about faith. But I think they're songs about, essentially they're songs about faith, and that can be either faith in love or faith in God. And what's interesting about it in the U2 canon is this, for the first time, that faith is wavering, that faith is being questioned. This, for the first time, is U2 considering love and considering faith as potentially a destructive force. They're kind of contemplating the possibility of Cupid as an assassin rather than an angel, I think. And that again, was quite a departure for them. It's quite, I mean, in that sense, it's quite a vicious and quite an ugly record in a lot of places.
Another striking way in which Achtung Baby differed from U2's previous work was that the band no longer seemed as strident and forthright about their moral values.
I'm not necessarily going to say the great thing about Achtung Baby is that they stepped away from the politics and the soapbox, but what is great about it is that they have shed some of the pomposity.
Pomposity is not something that goes down very well for very long. And I think that's one reason why Rattle and Hum began to exhaust a few people's patience. Had he kept that up on the next album, then I think that U2 might well have had a much more severe critical backlash. But Achtung Baby, as it were, turned round the critical community for what it's worth, just in time.
As one of the tracks says, their heart is where it's always been. I think they haven't changed in their overall approach to life and the purpose of existence, but they're casting it in a way that it doesn't hit you over the head, and it kind of infects you as you listen to the music, and you start thinking about what it is you're singing as you sing along to the radio driving in the car. I
think in U2's defense, it was probably as much a relief to them as any of their audiences at this point. I don't think they wanted to be the guys in the dusty cowboy hats waving the white flags any longer. Yeah, it's a much more personal record. It's a much less strident record than anything they'd done before.
After the album was released, U2 were faced with the challenge of taking this complex and postmodern record on the road. The shows were to be very different from the rock classicism of Rattle and Hum.
In the same way that Achtung Baby was a revolt against Rattle and Hum, the record, Zoo TV was a revolt against Rattle and Hum, the concert. It was everything that Rattle and Hum wasn't, whereas Rattle and Hum was beholden to, and just absolutely humorlessly and reverently beholden to this vast rock heritage that, they seemed desperately keen that we all should understand. Zoo TV was, nothing else mattered. It was all about the present. It was year zero. So they created this idea, this concept called Zoo TV, in which the shows would be kind of draped by these absolutely enormous digital screens, which, by the way, got bigger and bigger and bigger the longer the tour went on. And by the time it finished in Sydney and Japan in 1992, it was like an entire city block had been built at one end of the stadium. It was just absolutely colossal.
Zoo TV seemed to have been an attempt to take the conventions of the rock show and ramp everything up to beyond the limits, to take to take the conventional starting points of rock and roll excess and turn them in on themselves and get people thinking about the whole notion of spectacle, but turning it into the ultimate spectacle in the process. But it's umbilically linked to this record and to the themes that the record sets in motion about who we are, where we're going, the pace of the change that's overtaking everyone, the way that music is experienced, the way that ideas are disseminated, the power of advertising, and the attitudes and reach of the media, and the attitudes that media represents and seeks to reinforce. It was theatre, really, set in a sports arena and played by a rock band.
So they worked it hard. The songs that didn't work were the old songs. And that was the thing that the criticism was levelled most at. It's kind of like, okay, you're being postmodern here, you're being strange, you're playing the devil's advocate, but then why are you singing, Bullet the Blue Sky, or why are you singing With or Without You in the middle of this set? So that was a conundrum that they never really resolved.
On its release, U2's audience embraced the band's new direction, and Achtung Baby became a huge hit for the group, rivaling the success of the Joshua Tree.
Achtung Baby gives them a musical idiom, it gives them certain themes that they're still working out and they're still exploring in their music today.
This ongoing journey is still something that this record is very much a part of. And while it was a change sonically and perhaps in some other artistic ways, what's striking now is how neatly it fits into their chronology and their history.
Despite the record being the product of a time of reinvention and experimentation, Achtung Baby has become regarded both publicly and critically as a highlight of U2's career so far. A seminal album in 20th century rock music.
In terms of songwriting, in terms of sort of the musical ideas on it, and certainly of the lyrical ideas on it, I think it is by some margin actually their best album. I think it's one of the best records anybody made in the 1990s, and I think it's their best.